another session of our online conferences. The tragic catastrophe and the carnage in Syria is beyond description. The civil war has torn apart this ancient civilization with almost 500,000 casualties, 11 million displaced people, which is almost half of the population. The scope of the catastrophe is unbelievable. After a few weeks of a shaky and limited ceasefire, it's practically finished. As it is all over the social media, Aleppo is burning. Non-stop air raids, hundreds of civilian casualties as a result of dreadful and anti-human air raids by Assad and his international backers. Even makeshift hospitals and doctors are not spared. As Mrs. Maryam Rajavi, the president-elect of the Iranian resistance, put it, it's a war crime. To discuss the broken ceasefire by Assad regime, ongoing political and humanitarian catastrophe, the destructive role of the Iranian regime and its consequences, and solutions, as well as the policy by the West, we have invited a prominent European politician to join us in this conference, Mr. Struan Stevenson. Mr. Stevenson is the president of the European Iraqi Freedom Association, a respected think tank and NGO based in Brussels. Many of you probably know Mr. Stevenson in his former capacity as a distinguished member of the European Parliament from Scotland and the president of the European Parliament's Delegation for Relations with Iraq. In this capacity, Mr. Stevenson traveled a number of times to the region and has met many of the key players and politicians in person. Mr. Stevenson, welcome to this program.
Good afternoon.
Let me start my question from the latest development. Aleppo is burning. The fragile city is practically gone because of unbridled bombing of the Assad regime. Do you think can there be a true lasting ceasefire as long as Assad is in power?
Absolute savagery of the Assad regime for what is happening. And of course, it's the savagery of the Assad regime that has created the civil war and indeed has led to the creation of ISIS. But you have to be clear, while the air force of the Assad regime is savagely bombing civilian targets in Aleppo and killing men, women and children, innocent men, women and children, and causing the absolute brutality that has outraged the world and has led to this humanitarian catastrophe. You have to be clear that there are actually no Assad regular soldiers on the ground. All of the ground fighting is being sponsored and involves the Iranian regime. The Iranian regime has been meddling in Syria for many, many years. But because of the Iranian regime's interference, because of their outright support for the tyrant, for the dictator Bashar al-Assad, they have encouraged the civil war to continue. They have poured petrol on the flames of conflict, which has led now, after almost 6 years of civil war, to the death of hundreds of thousands of people, to the biggest refugee crisis that Europe has witnessed since the Second World War. If it had not been for the support of the Iranian regime, Assad would have gone many years ago. Many years ago, the civil war would have stopped. But the regime has decided that this is vital for their own existence. The tyrants in Tehran have decided that Syria is of such importance that if Bashar al-Assad falls, it will undermine their own power base in Tehran. Now that is why they have sent more than 60,000 soldiers to fight in Syria. 60,000 soldiers, including tens of thousands from the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps, including 8,000 of their foreign expeditionary Quds force, listed as terrorists in the West. But also, this is a proxy war. The Iranians are now recruiting foreign mercenaries from militias, Shia militias in Iraq, from Lebanon, from Afghanistan and Pakistan. Indeed, they have now deployed a massive battalion from inside Iran of Afghan troops. By figures from the Iranian regime's own calculations, there are over 1.5 million Afghan refugees inside Iran. Now, upwards of 800,000 to 1 million of these people have no identity cards. They, as a result, have no jobs. They're living in abject poverty. And the regime has now started to recruit them, to form them into a brigade, a battalion, and now a division. 2,500 of them have been deployed to fight on the front line in Syria, and they've been promised in return that they will receive full Iranian citizenship, as well as $600 every month while they are fighting in the front line in Syria. This demonstrates the desperation, really the desperation of the Iranian regime to try to hold on to control of what is happening in Syria. You know, only this week they have appointed a mullah as the personal representative of Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei. They have personal representatives of the supreme leader in each of the 31 provinces of Iran, but now they have appointed a personal representative of the supreme leader for Syria, almost indicating that they regard Syria as their 32nd province. This is how vital upholding the bloody dictatorship of Bashar al-Assad is to the regime. They have even, I think sickeningly, this week, the IRGC has released a video showing children dressed in military uniform singing a song. I can read you some of the words. The children sing, "On my leader Ali Khamenei's orders, I am ready to give my life. The goal is not just to free Iraq and Syria. My path is through the sacred shrine in Syria, but my goal is to reach Jerusalem." Now, this sickening video is an attempt by the IRGC to recruit children to go and fight in the front line in Syria. And it has echoes of what happened during the long Iran-Iraq war, when the original founder of the Iranian Revolution, Khomeini, sent tens of thousands of children to a needless death on the front line in that war. Here we are again. They're trying to recruit child soldiers to die in Syria on the front line. They are desperate now, and I can only see disaster and catastrophe arising from this. There is no way they're going to win this war. There is no way that they will beat the proud Free Syrian Army. This is only going to lead to tens of thousands of more innocent deaths, and it's time the West woke up and realized what is happening. Iran is not the solution. Iran is the problem.
Yes. What role Iranian regime has been playing in Syria? I mean, it claims that its military presence is only for advisors and is limited number. What do your sources tell you about that?
This is complete nonsense. You know, now for the first time, they have actually deployed a battalion of the regular Iranian army, the Nohed or Green Berets, which is a brigade of the Iranian army, has been deployed for the first time to Syria. This is now a direct war involving the Iranian army, as well as the IRGC, the Quds Force, and the Shia militias recruited, the mercenaries recruited from all around the Middle East, and indeed from as far afield as Pakistan. It's a war, not only a war of proxy, it is a war involving directly, for the first time, the Iranian military. This is why they've sent their chief of staff, Major General Hassan Firuzabadi. He has been sent to Damascus in the last few days to take control of the whole military structure fighting the war against the Syrian Free Army, particularly in Aleppo, one of their strongholds. But it's also why the head of the commander of the IRGC, General Qassem Soleimani, was sent recently to Moscow to plead with Vladimir Putin for more Russian intervention in Syria. The supreme leader in Iran, Khamenei, is now panicking that Putin is beginning to withdraw some of his military presence, some of his air force from the conflict in Syria, isolating now the Iranian regime. And this is why they have sent Soleimani to Moscow, trying to plead with Putin to re-involve more Russian forces in the Syrian conflict. They can see that they are bogged down now in a quagmire, which has given a deadlock to the situation. It's caused hundreds of thousands of deaths and injuries amongst innocent Syrians, but it has also led to many thousands of casualties amongst the regular Iranian forces and the IRGC. And that itself is causing a backlash from the IRGC troops, who are completely demoralized because of the constant defeat that they are facing in the Syrian conflict. And back home in Iran, I think the general population now, from all the information I'm receiving, the general population are sickened by the rising casualties, including even more than 40 generals from the IRGC have been killed in the conflict in the last year. And the general population of Iran are sickened by this, and they are increasingly becoming concerned at Iranian meddling in Syria. For all of these reasons, the regime in Iran is now teetering on the brink of a catastrophe because of its involvement in Iran, and because of the way it has used neighboring countries like Iraq, where the former Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki was a puppet of the Iranian regime. They used Iraq as a conduit for sending personnel, military forces into Syria, and that in turn, with Nouri al-Maliki's genocidal campaign against his own Sunni population, that simply encouraged ISIS, who had begun to take control of large parts of Syria. It encouraged them to come into Iraq, where they have seized great swathes of Iraqi territory. So behind all of the problems that we're confronting now, the refugee crisis in Europe, the rise of ISIS causing a global threat, all of these problems can be traced back directly to the Iranian regime.
What do you think, from what you know and from what you have gathered, the scope of the Iranian regime's involvement in Syria is fully realized, or is it under-realized and under-reported in the West?
I think the West has always got the policy in dealing with the Middle East completely wrong. While President Obama has been, if you like, foot dragging in terms of his involvement in the Syrian conflict, dragging his feet has actually only encouraged the explosive civil war that is continuing to this day and has gone on for nearly 6 years. So, you know, this foot dragging is not good enough. Really, we have to ask President Obama in the closing months of his presidency to take a more proactive role. The only way we are going to solve this humanitarian crisis is to get rid of Assad and to evict the Iranians from Syria and from neighboring Iraq. It is the only way that we will stop this horrendous humanitarian conflict.
Mr. Stevenson, I read the other day that Iran has virtually dispatched a large number of Afghan refugees to fight in Syria, and they are taking big casualties. How many Afghans are we talking about, and why? Iran is a big country. There are not enough Iranians to send there to fight? Or is it because Iranians don't want to go and fight and the regime has no choice but to resort to people like the Afghans?
Yeah, it's quite clear that the people of Iran are fed up. They're sick of their regime, the tyrants who rule Iran, meddling in the zone, and particularly they're sick of their meddling inside Syria. And for that reason, they are showing an increasing reluctance to allow their sons to be sent to be needlessly slaughtered in Syria. And in some desperation now, the regime in Tehran has turned to the huge number of Afghan refugees who live in Iran but have no identity cards, no documentation, and as a result, no jobs. They live in abject poverty. So they've turned to them now. And in desperation, they have set up the Fatemyun division of Afghan soldiers. And they're training them and sending them every day in plane loads, 200 at a time. A huge escalation of the deployment of Afghan troops in the past month alone. And they're sent to Damascus and then deployed to the front line around Aleppo, where they're taking huge casualties. Now, the promise, the bribery that is involved, they're saying to these Afghans, when you return, if you return from Syria, you will be given full citizenship of Iran, and while you are there, you will be paid $600 a month. The leaders of the Fatemyun division are paid $1,000 a month for the officers. And for this kind of bribery, paid for by the Iranian regime, they are recruiting Afghans who have no choice, they have no money, they're living in poverty, they can't even afford to feed their families, and they are being sent to their deaths in Syria to try and prop up Bashar al-Assad. It is an international disgrace, and the West really has to wake up to this.
How about the regular army? Has Iran begun to dispatch regular army there?
They have. They've sent a division of what's called the No-Head or Green Berets force. It's a brigade of the Iranian army. They have been sent there for the first time. This is an absolute escalation. This means that Iran is involved in a ground war with regular troops from the Iranian military are now engaged in the conflict in Syria. And here we have John Kerry in Geneva blaming the savagery of the Assad regime for what is happening around Aleppo and for the breakdown of the ceasefire. And in reality, it is the Iranian troops and mercenaries fighting a proxy war paid for by Iran who are causing the savagery and the breakdown of the ceasefire.
Yes. From all indications, Tehran is fighting with whatever it has in Syria. Sometimes it looks like that Iranian regime is fighting inside of Iran. What does it tell us about the Iranian regime status? Is this a sign of strength or desperation for Iran? Some say it shows that Khamenei is in a quagmire and has no way out and has no way forward in Syria. What's your take on that?
Well, because from the outset, Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei identified Bashar al-Assad as one of his key allies and identified Syria as virtually the 32nd province of Iran. Because of that, if Bashar al-Assad is removed from power, if he is defeated and Syria falls to the control of the Free Syrian Army, this will be seen as a massive defeat for the mullahs in Tehran and their fascist regime, and it would undermine their credibility, and it would probably bring down their tyrannical regime. That's why they're desperately striving to regain control of the situation inside Syria and to try to bolster the Assad regime. But in doing so, they're simply prolonging the savage civil war, which has already led to the death of hundreds of thousands of people and to the destruction of this ancient part of our civilized world.
Yes. Let me ask you a challenging question. What you say those who say, look, it's Russian and Assad who are bombing Aleppo and Iranians are not directly involved. So why focus so much on Iran? What would you like to say about this?
Well, of course, this is just simply wrong. Of course, the Assad regime is using barrel bombs and all kinds of horrendous weapons to kill innocent women and children and innocent civilians, even bombing hospitals. And of course, Russia has been involved. They claimed that they were joining the West in fighting ISIS in Syria. But we know full well that they were in fact bombing the Free Syrian Army. They were bombing the moderate Syrian opposition because they too, along with the Iranian regime, were desperate to allow Bashar al-Assad to maintain his bloody dictatorship. But, you know, it is nonsense to say that they are the only ones involved. Iran is the key sponsor of virtually all of the ground troops that are now fighting around Aleppo and killing thousands and thousands of innocent Syrian civilians.
What do you think of the policy by the West in general and by the US in specific in Syria? Don't you think it has been weak, spineless, and has provided a green light to Tehran and Russia to do what they want in Syria with impunity?
Well, you know, we've seen from America, we've seen Obama, on the one hand, signing a nuclear agreement with the Iranian regime, trying to create his legacy in history as the President of the United States, and in so doing, releasing billions of dollars of assets that had been frozen under the sanctions that were imposed by the West previously on Iran. And those assets are simply being used now by the Iranian regime, which was teetering on the brink of economic collapse. This has thrown a lifeline to the regime, and they're using it not to improve the living standards of the people of Iran. They're using it now to spend more and more money on men and weapons to fight the war in Syria, to bolster Bashar al-Assad, and in so doing, to lead to the death and destruction of tens of thousands of more innocent civilians in Syria. This is the result of the nuclear deal. And yet at the same time, we have seen Obama reluctant to become involved in the Syrian conflict. And his foot dragging has caused the conflict to escalate, has emboldened the mullahs to commit more and more atrocities. Previously, we also saw the UN, the US, and the EU backing Nouri al-Maliki, the genocidal leader of he was the prime minister in Iraq for 2 terms. He was a puppet of the Iranian regime. We warned again and again that Maliki was going to drag his country into civil conflict. And in doing so, because he was fighting a genocidal campaign against his own Sunni population. In doing so, he opened the door for ISIS to come into Iraq and to capture huge swathes of Iraqi territory. And in doing that, ISIS also captured massive military garrisons teeming with modern weaponry that had been supplied by the US to the Iraqi forces. ISIS now has all of this modern weaponry, which is being used against the Free Syrian Army in neighboring Syria in the civil war there, and is being used against Western forces. So, you know, we have a lot to blame. Our policy of appeasement, which was stimulated by the US and followed by the EU and the UN, has created the disaster that has given rise to ISIS. Now they have to recognize this fact and recognize that only by getting rid of Assad immediately, by getting rid of Assad and by evicting the Iranians from Syria and from Iraq, that is the only way they will resolve this crisis and bring the catastrophe of the Syrian civil war to an end.
Some people in the West contend that Rouhani is a different kind, and the West can work with him on some issues like the Syrian crisis. Do you believe in this? And do you see any difference between Rouhani and Khamenei on Syria or on anything altogether?
Oh, well, of course, Rouhani is completely powerless. The power completely resides with the supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, inside Iran, and Rouhani jumps to his command all the time. But Rouhani, you see, he comes to the West and he smiles, and everybody in the West immediately thinks, oh, he must be a moderate. Here we have a mullah who smiles to the cameras and who shakes hands with all the Western leaders. He must be a moderate, he must be someone we can work with. But, you know, during the short time he has been in power, more than 2,400 people have been executed in Iran, many of them hanged in public. This is the catastrophe. This is the reality of the so-called moderate leadership of Rouhani inside the Iranian regime. So he is no different from Khamenei in any way. Indeed, in many ways, he is worse than his predecessor, Ahmadinejad. More people now are being executed in Iran than even under Ahmadinejad.
So what's the policy that you propose for the West to adopt on Syria in general and on the Iranian regime's involvement in Syria and Iraq in specific?
Well, the West must unite in ensuring the destruction of Bashar al-Assad. We must get rid of Assad if we are to bring this horrible civil war to an end and save more lives. And the only way we're going to be able to do that is by evicting the Iranians from Iran, from Syria and from Iraq.
Yes. What will you say to those who say that the priority of the West in Syria and the Middle East has to be to defeating ISIS, and that's where the focus should be? Do you think it's possible to defeat ISIS as long as we have Assad in power in Syria?
No, I mean, ISIS is a byproduct of the civil war in Syria. It's because of the Iranian regime and Nouri al-Maliki, the previous prime minister of Iraq. It's because of their support for the savagery of Bashar al-Assad that allowed the creation of ISIS in Syria, and then the interference of ISIS in neighboring Iraq. Iran and Nouri al-Maliki themselves are the sponsors of what happened in Syria and gave rise to ISIS. Only by dealing with Bashar al-Assad and dealing with the Iranian regime are we going to stop this humanitarian catastrophe.
Yes. And my last question will be a bit unrelated and in a way related. Would you be attending the July 9 major gathering of the Iranian resistance in Paris?
Yeah, well, of course, I have attended it every year for many years now, and it's one of the great rallies of the world. It is one of the biggest political events that takes place on the world stage every year. Now, last year, over 100,000 Iranian expats attended the rally in Paris. When people say to me that the PMOI, the MEK, has little support inside Iran, where, of course, if you announce your support for the PMOI or the MEK, you will immediately be arrested, tortured, and executed, because it's written into the constitution of the Iranian regime that support for the PMOI is waging war against God and carries the automatic death penalty. You know, for people to say to me that there is little support for the PMOI inside Iran, I say to them, well, come and see the 100,000 Iranians who come to the rally in Paris every year and who attract senior political support from almost every country in the world, from America, from Europe, from the Australia, New Zealand, and from all around the world. All of these Iranians who come to Paris have extended families still inside Iran, who must number in their millions. This is the truth of the extent of support there is for the PMOI. And this is why the opposition to the current regime in Tehran, led by the courageous and inspiring Mariam Rajabi, is going to be the future for freedom, democracy, women's rights, human rights, an end to the death penalty and an end to nuclear weapons. This is the future for Iran, not the bloodthirsty, savage, fascist regime that is ruling Iran today and interfering in many countries in the Middle East, destabilizing the Middle East and causing a threat to the world.
Yes, yes. And with that, I would like to thank Mr. Stevenson for taking part in our conference and to thank all of you for participating in this session. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you very much.